And so our next speaker is Cornelia Fermuller. She's an associate research scientist with affiliations in the Institute for Systems Research and the Institute for Advanced Computer Studies. And her talk is on event vision for navigation. Cornelia, please.
So I'm the third member here of the ARC lab. And we have in our lab also going on activity on drone navigation, and under the hood a lot of work on the visual processes that they're doing it. And I will focus today here mostly on what we're doing regarding event vision, some new sensor. And you can check out the work at the BRG group, where you will find videos as well as explanations. For example, here on the left, the drone flying through gaps, and on the right with event-based data, without actually making too complicated models of the world. So these are the arguments why we need this for drone vision. You all are familiar with SLAM, who works with drones. And the basic idea is we're having classic sensors and we're taking multiple views of the scene. And in each of these views, we will find points that are the same in the 3D scene. Here shown these PGKs, we correspond them to each other. And if from that information, then we can say how is the camera positioned relative to each other, which is the 3D motion, and then also what is the world model out there. So we get the depths and the scene. So that's the classic approach that everybody follows, and now in a probabilistic formulation called SLAM. However, it's very expensive, of course. And there are still challenges with this approach. It works well in a static world, but if you have moving objects or very fast moving objects, it doesn't work really well. And usually most systems, what you saw on autonomous driving earlier today also, they add other sensors, LiDAR sensors, which are of course heavy. And each LiDAR sensor has its own range in which it really works. So putting them on smaller drones is kind of infeasible. But if you look at nature, and that has been a motivation for all my research, there are so many systems out there, even the bees, that solve these problems. And that's where we want to take inspiration from and put them on drones, bigger ones and smaller ones that actually can only compute from perception a small amount. And that they have a number of sensors and have to ideally distribute somehow what's feasible for the task at hand. That's what we're referring to as the swap. So one motivation, don't reconstruct the world. The other motivation, actually, I talked about individual frames and features being corresponded. That's how the community has been treating motion, really as a static problem. We're having static images and we find some correspondence. Again, that's really not how biology works. More simple systems only see motion, actually. So we do have, from the very early, processes that are tuned to motion. As we humans see points and edges, we really see motion too. And we have, for 25 years already, we worked on implementing this. In this case, we simulated it. We say there are findings in the neurosciences that there are spatiotemporal filters. So let us just use those spatiotemporal filters as we derive the output, as we derive it from a stack of images as input, and developed so-called, this output is what's called geometrically normal flow. And nowadays there's something in addition, biological motivated or neuromorphic sensors that actually record just changes. And again, we have those in biology. Your system has, in addition to static signals only just change in images. So what am I talking about? If this is a sensor recording, what you will get is you set a threshold, while a classic camera would compute something like images everywhere. This just computes changes. So what you do is the sensor records in logarithmic space and sets a threshold, for example, 10% of change, then it gives a spike or event. So that's why and the sensor is such that each pixel has its own electronics built in. So they're working asynchronously. It's very fast. It's because it works logarithmically. Here are some examples, even the dark night scene. This is what you would get. And this is a visualization. You visualize the events over a certain time interval. You squash them down to an image. Or here also the dark image. Clearly the moving things stand out because that's where changes are happening. And there are advantages to it. As you see here, the output, when we visualize it in 3D, it's really like a cloud of points, each pixel, each point coming out, each event coming out at the time it happens. It has high temporal resolution. We're getting lots of events, high dynamic range because we're recording logarithmically, low bandwidth, we're only recording changes, low latency, but you also have to deal with noise at this stage. So the work went into how can we make this sensor, these neuromorphic sensors, and neuromorphic means low power. We are talking about 10,000ths of the power a camera would need. So ideally, these are fitted for small drones. Now, how do we work with this idiosyncratic signal to make it work on the drones and in conjunction maybe with other sensors? And we started out classically when we got it a number of years ago, first thinking about normal flow and flow which comes out instantaneously, and developed our methods, but of course it's noisy. So then it started, how do we overcome this noisiness and work more qualitatively? And I give you a small overview of recent work. We developed optimization approaches, learning approaches. We recorded data sets so we can actually learn. We applied it to drones, and now we're working with these whole surfaces as work is going on to squeeze out most of the information. So let me give you some intuition. So you're having basically clouds as we know them from RGBD sensing, but they are different. They are asynchronously in time. There's a regular grid. So first we thought about how can we work after doing normal flow and flow robustly with it. And the idea came up, we really have to kind of solve motion and segmentation and problems together in a way to fit models and make it over the larger plane. So you see here the cloud coming out that I showed you before. And our first was approach, we take a time slice, and within that time slice, if we can simplify or make the assumption that there's some model behind the motion with which we move the camera, then we can linearize it. So a simple model just consists of 4 parameters: linear, expansion, and circular rotation. And so the idea is basically if we can linearly fit, so this kind of linear model, fit to it, then we can, within this time slice, then every point at each time can be shifted via the model back to the beginning of the time slice, and it should align. And when it is aligned, we basically would get then a very sharp function. And this was the idea of the method. So basically warp the signal via some model in 3D and find the parameters of that warping that gives you the best images. So while you see here on the right, the image, a time slice of images, Then, and here the events are encoded by time with the different colors denoting back in time. Then if you motion compensate, you find the right parameters through an optimization process that actually can be done very fast on the gradients of these timestamps. You get a sharp image and you compensate it for the motion. And whatever is blurred is then the independently moving object. So that's kind of the idea of this method. And recorded various data sets, a data set to actually show this with drones here in the ARC lab. And here I show you some highlights of, even when there is flashing light, we can still detect the boxes, detect this independently moving object standing out, because it doesn't fit the model. So in recent work, then we focused more on the component of the segmentation and added in also tracking approaches and refining the segmentation that was just recently published in ICRO. So the next thing is then, how can we also learn with this model? And we picked up this idea here of self-supervised learning in event space. So if you're not familiar, the global idea is we have this displacement, our motion field, we call it flow, and it depends on the rigid motion, some 6 parameters, the rotation and the translation, some things that we know depend on the image, and the depths in view. So in some way, if we know the depths and we know the rigid motion, we know the flow, and we can compensate for it. And that's how the network learns. It has one component that tries to estimate the depths from single slices or multiple slices of this. One component that learns the rigid motion, and it is trained via this alignment. If it is correct, we know what the alignment is, and we train it on that function. And our contribution, we made this net very light. We made it work also with the sparse signal that actually event has. And it's totally self-supervised. You have the data itself training, so you don't need annotation. And the thing can also be expanded to account for moving objects, in which case, because we don't have yet millions of data, we have created a data set that has independently moving objects, and there's a supervised component inside. So the model is then enhanced to account for multiple moving objects and learns multiple models in order to then learn them. So advantages of this technique: we use the data set from the driving scenario and show that we actually can transfer data from day to night because of the sensor. We took care of the sparsity. We have great results. So let me show you something here. If this is the event input in the first column, and this is the ground truth flow, this is our output, which you see is very good. And here, the same thing with depths. Actually, at some scenarios, it shows up while the LiDAR sensor didn't catch objects close by, the depth network actually got them right. And then the rigid motion, again, this is the standard view. Does it do loop closure? It does pretty well. The ground truth versus the inferenced trajectory. And what you need is a data set, and that we have created and made available, which actually didn't exist even for regular sensors yet, a very accurate thing. And we used in the ARC lab the Vicon system. So the first approach was we scanned the room, and then we scanned a number of objects at very high resolution. The Vicon system is then tracking the markers on this object. So altogether we have the complete scene knowledge exactly where it is, and software written to label, frame, to label the objects at individual times. And you know exactly now how the moving objects are. Since this is an indoor scene, so cars were on invisible fishing rods, they are moving around with large motions, with small motions randomly. You have images and DVS data. And in recent work, we have by now different sensors, which by now also Samsung and a company called Prophecy are designing with by now way higher spatial resolution. And we made a rig out of these different sensors that is calibrated and recorded with this rig data, ego motion, independently moving objects, diverse objects at very high resolution that now the community can use to actually have ground truths and test. The same idea here now, I show you a drone implementation of this network learning was implemented on a paper called EV-Dodge. So the camera is here equipped with a front-facing and a down-facing event-based sensor, DVS. It also has a sonar and IMU on it. And it only does online computing here on NVIDIA GPU. So the downward facing camera, since it doesn't have obstacles here, was facilitated. We fit the homography to it on the DVS. And actually that homography was learned in a similar way as I showed you before, learning complete ego motion here, a bit similar, and trained on synthetic data, since homography is a bit easier. And the blur net was invented to of the real data to transfer it to the synthetic data. Having this ego motion now via the homography, the segment objects were segmented, which were trained on as before. And you can see here then with some demo, the drone is dodging. The thing is also available on the website. What the front camera sees, what the back camera sees is shown up in windows. Here, different scenarios, things are thrown on the drone and it dodges away. Here, it's 3D things, it detects the thing. The controller is here after it detects the object, the linear controller. The gist lies in segmenting fast and accurately. And if you can dodge, you can also pursue. All right, so here goes the drone. So finally, let me show you where we are going here. We went from flow over event slices, but we actually have this data available, which is like these whole tubes of data that are carved out here with color coding shown from the past to the more recent in red of this cup flying around for visualization. So segmentation is still hard when there is variation in speed, because with large motions, then you can't downsample, because if large and small come together, you can't appropriately just downsample and you have to deal with it. And it's also very hard when there's occlusions. But the event tubes are there, they're not losing it, even the large motion. And occlusions are there too. If you can look back in the time, intuitively you may resolve all these cases when things come together. And that's what we have been looking at. We looked at these event surfaces that are carved out as an object moves. So to give you some intuition, when there's a C translation of this object, this is just the event surface, what you're getting then, as a C translation, the camera moves towards the objects. You're getting a surface like this. So when you move parallel to the object, something like this. And when you twist around your axis, you would get some twisted surface like this. And the first approach was, can we segment in this with this whole cloud? And that was a supervised approach. The idea is that we now encode the events in graphs. So you now you're completely free with time. You're not creating slices which are image-like structures anymore, but you leave the full data in the graph. And the graph convolutional network consisting of 5 layers. Data was appropriately pre-processed by looking at the radius, downsampling it, and estimating also the normal. The normal to these surfaces is basically what is similar to what we know as normal flow. And then we trained this graph convolutional network with the data set described before to detect independently moving objects. So the left column would show you what kind of the ground truth is. That's what we're getting as input in the second column, and we can get the inference very good now from this longer data. So this is data now over half a second. You use the whole half a second to train the network. Yeah, okay, so here you see some visualizations of this tube, the input sequence, and how you get inference now over time versus ground truth of these moving objects here that carves out the space. So as it goes on, this was supervised learning. The next step is now processes in motion. There is modeling involved that should be there, but there's also segmentation that somehow needs learning because it also depends on the scene. The two need to be combined. So what we are doing right now is really study the optimization and analytic approaches to deal with those surfaces and then combine them eventually in learning, where the normals to the surfaces are basically what's local image motion, and the whole surface encodes both velocity, acceleration, and the objects moving in background. And this was done in the ARC lab, but the main people involved were Anton and Chetan, who work on DBS, and Nitin, who does lots of the drone work, Shanxi, who got the learning done, Francisco, with whom I started originally computing flow, and Howard, who helped with the graph convolutional network. So thank you to all of those.
Thank you, Cornelia, again for the wonderful presentation. We do have one quick question before we move on to the next part of the agenda. So this is from Clinton and Worm. And the question is, can the event-based cloud data from neuromorphic sensors be fused with data from more traditional laser-based sensors or depth cameras to create a more robust visual SLAM system?
It definitely can be fused with images, and there have been already some attempts. There's also attempts to fuse it with classic images, which give them, we don't even have the exact image intensity there. So now I'm not sure that you want to actually use laser-based sensors because they are heavy, and this is exactly the motivation why we are using this, to be lightweight and efficient. But yes, we can fuse. Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you so much. Mm-hmm. And so with that, we are going to move